I'm extremely pleased to welcome this week's speaker, Neel Smith, who's spoken in this series before and is a colleague and friend of long-standing, Professor of Classics at the College of Holy Cross, and is going to speak to us today about scholarly reasoning and writing in an automatically assembled and tested digital library. Neel.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back of the room?
Yes.
Please let me know if it gets too much competition from the window. And thank you very much, Gabby, for the introduction. I am delighted to have the opportunity to be here today. This is always such an interesting audience to talk to, and I'm taking the liberty of trying to raise a few broader questions that I think we often do in the world of digital humanities at this kind of event. I promise that I will click on some buttons and make some things happen on the screen as well. With that, let me just get underway, except to add, I know we have the brickbat session afterwards, but if you have questions in the course of the presentation, I'm glad to take them en route if that would be helpful. Since I'm about halfway en route between the British coast and the American coast, it might be necessary. I was mentioned in the abstract that I sent around that I've been reading recently Donald Knuth's classic work on the subject where he coined the term literate programming. And his idea, now more than 30 years old, is that computer programs are not simply sets of machine instructions. They are also works of literature. They are written not only for a machine to act upon, but for human beings to read and make sense of. And his thesis was that if he approached the task of writing programs as a work of literature for human readers, that he would write better programs. And that's been his experience. And what I want to pose as an initial question is whether we can reverse that thought and ask whether our writing that we are accustomed to think of as works of literature aimed at a human audience can also be conceived as something that a machine can act on. Can we, I don't know if the right phrase then would be programmed literature. I'd be glad to take suggestions for how to invert Kuhn's phrase. Literate programming works wonderfully well. I'm not sure programmed literature works so well, but that's the idea that I want to approach with you today. And I would like to thank the American Historical Association for making my introduction easy. The point of Knuth's question, and the reason I want to raise this sort of parallel question with you today, is that Knuth challenged how people thought about the act of programming. What's the real essence of our work? And I think that if we as people involved in the digital humanities have a contribution to make, it's in taking advantage of the experience with different media, different technologies to reflect on those very broad kinds of questions. Just last week, the American Historical Association proved why that's necessary. Let me read only the first sentence of this essay, of this statement from the AHA Council. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this is the professional organization for historians in the United States. If you have a faculty job in history, you will be a member of this. You will have gone through this organization to interview and secure a job. The American Historical Association strongly encourages graduate programs and university libraries to adopt a policy that allows the embargoing of completed history PhD dissertations in digital form for as many as 6 years. You can't make this stuff up. You cannot make this up. This is about as perfect an example as you could want of what I think of as the sort of instrumentalist fallacy. Their argument is that a book is a codex artifact, and what we do as historians is create codices. And so a digital document might threaten the production of the codex, and therefore we should embargo it, because what we are doing is making more books to gather shelves on more libraries. Ensure, first of all, that no one reads your dissertation, because then, they might not buy the book. That's the thrust of their argument. I encourage you to read it if you find this incredible. I couldn't possibly parrot it. They're beyond parroting. But digital humanists are, I think at times also susceptible to an instrumentalist kind of trap. And if I could just quote that wonderful authority, XKCD, let me try to read this to you. It's just a little recent cartoon that has an update notice. Changes in version 10.17. The CPU no longer overheats when you hold down spacebar. User comment on that. This update broke my workflow. My control key is hard to reach, so I hold spacebar instead and configured Emacs to interpret a rapid temperature rise as control. Please restore spacebar heating. Well, all right, I'm an Emacs user, so maybe it's funnier to me, but the point is you can probably, without much effort, think of digital projects where we think in terms of digital artifacts rather than what we're really doing. Again, I'm also a long-time TEI user. I've been editing TEI documents since version 2 in SQL, about the time Kuhn was working on the idea of literate programming. And it's not hard to think of examples in that world where people have made the TEI document into something all-encompassing, whether it ought to be. Or today, a more contemporary example in the very exciting discussions around the whole subject of linked data. I think it's not hard to find examples where at times that sort of devolves into linked web pages. And if we're giving up on the idea that what we do as scholars in the humanities is create physical artifacts like a codex, that's one instantiation of something more significant. We also don't want to fall into the trap of saying what we do as humanists is create web pages. That's the same fallacy, just with two different artifacts. So what we really have to offer, I think, is from the experience of working with multiple technologies, multiple media, a perspective that allows us to describe more abstractly and more generally models or specifications for what we do. And I'll just give a couple of very simple examples today. Let me start with an extraordinarily broad one. I would argue that one of the distinctive features of scholarship in the humanities is its particularity, its specificity. A chemist can start with a statement that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, and it doesn't matter what molecules of water you collect. They should boil at 100 degrees centigrade. That generality, that sort of generic law is part of the beauty and power of the natural sciences. We can't do that. And part of the beauty and power of the humanities is precisely the specificity of the rich material we study. So if I assert that the Homeric poems illustrate features of oral composition, that's not really the same as saying add any two molecules of water, raise the temperature to 100 degrees, and it's going to boil. I have to be able to very concretely talk about what in the Homeric epics that might or might not correspond more or less precisely with what Albert Lord and Milman Parry saw in Serbo-Croatian oral poetry, or find your comparison. We're always working really, we always start from a kind of inductive process, starting from something concrete. Well, what I would argue is that then that means in our scholarship, citation has a primary role. We have to be able to identify and cite unambiguously what it is we are talking about. So when we come to writing, in other words, we need to know what we're talking about. This is a remarkably pedestrian sounding statement, but it's not that easy to put into practice. So, much as I hate this phrase, machine actionable, I'll let it creep in once today. In the next few minutes, I want to describe some work that over the past decade, as I've been working with colleagues on the Homer Multitext project, sponsored by the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, working on creating editions of Greek manuscripts of the Iliad with scholia. We've been wrestling with this problem of how do we represent digitally that very rich corpus of material. How do we write about it? How do we talk about it? Are questions I'm increasingly interested in. And it starts from citation. So we have developed two forms of citation that we can use to identify anything we are working with in the whole scope of this project. Both of them are URNs, that is uniform resource names. I hope I get that right, expand that abbreviation, right? They're not URLs. URLs are addresses, locations. URNs are names. They are independent of any technology. One way that I like to phrase it is they pass the paper napkin test. You can write a URN on a paper napkin and hand it to somebody and it still means something. And so an example you can think of is an ISBN number. There's actually a URN. The URN format is an engineering task force standard. There is a URN format for ISBNs. You can write them down and walk into a bookshop and have a good chance of finding out whether or not they own the book. You can type it into a web browser. Amazon will probably happily take your credit card without any further ado. You can work with them in a digital environment. You can work with them in other kinds of environments. They're not dependent on any particular technology. That's what we are doing to talk about texts. And we use a form of citation that we call the canonical text service, URN. It allows us to talk about passages of text in particular versions in relation to other versions of that text. And we have a URN notation for discrete objects. So if I want to refer to a manuscript, I can refer to it. If I want to refer to a folio in a manuscript, I can refer to it. If I am collecting observations about particular features, let's say something like choir numbers that I'm observing on a manuscript page, I can collect those as discrete objects that I can cite with one of these URNs. And I'll use an example in just a few moments where I'll illustrate how we can extend those URNs to cite not only images as discrete artifacts, but to extend that notation to cite regions of interest in an image. And that has allowed us to tie together things like textual editions, appearances of textual material in documentary photographs, and so forth. So what these examples aren't particularly important to go through in detail, but the point I want to make is simply we have a syntax independent of any technology that, in effect, carries out or defines this idea that citation is what we start from. We have to have a way of talking about everything that we are studying. Just a further example in a little more detail. We have an explicit model for citable text that, again, is not dependent on any technology. And I don't want to go through in bloody detail all of its details of what led to this. It grows out of discussion that dates back to the late 80s about the relation of text to markup editions of text. But what I'd just like to summarize is that we can identify 4 properties of citable texts. And remember, for scholarly writing, everything has to be citable. So the texts that I'm going to work with are scholarly texts. I'm not talking about creative art performances, but in a citable text, there are 4 properties that have to be preserved in any representation. You can think of the citable text as a set. Mathematically, it's a set of nodes. Each set is uniquely identified. Each node is uniquely identified in the set. And those nodes have an order, so you can read the document in document order. But they also conceivably belong to a hierarchy of citation. So if we think about an example like the Iliad, line 1 of the Iliad also belongs to book 1 of the Iliad. Then we can have a citation hierarchy as well as an order. And each cited node also belongs to an ontological hierarchy of the works. If I talk about a particular node that I'm citing in a particular passage of text, in a particular version, this manuscript versus another, this print edition versus another version, I also need to be able to specify what version of the text. The works also have a hierarchy independent of and orthogonal to the sequence of nodes within a version. And finally, the model of our text, citable text model, allows us to have rich content within a node. That is, we are not asserting that when you cite a node, it consists solely of just characters of text. It might have markup, it might have other kinds of content, it might have rich content of whatever kind. Now, what's been very valuable to us on the Homer Multitext project over the past year, 2 years especially, is that we've been able to use this sort of abstract model to produce multiple implementations, multiple representations of our texts, and to prove that they're equivalent. That is to prove that they preserve each of these four properties as you transform them from one form to another. Now, one very straightforward way to create a model of a text that preserves those four properties is in a tree structure. Trees have nice hierarchy containing, you can imagine very easily how nodes of a document correspond to nodes in a tree. And guess what? All of you who've ever seen an XML document, it's essentially a syntax for representing a tree model. So trees are really good ways for representing this, many features of this model. But there are times when we don't want to necessarily work with a tree model. And two other models that we have been making extensive use of are to create a tabular structure that captures exactly the same information but represents it in a tabular or relational form, and a graph model. And you can imagine, if you will, where we're going to go with this in just a moment. You have the freedom to choose the representation that is best for your particular task, because you can guarantee and you can test with the machine and verify that each representation is equivalent and preserves all of those properties. So when we're editing a text, we use XML. There are great XML editors out there. You can have validating syntax. People have lots of good tools at hand for editing XML text. But there are certain kinds of analysis. For example, when we do a typed tokenization of the text and want to analyze the contents of the text, it can actually be more convenient and practical in many cases if we work from a tabular data structure. So tools that let you say, here's your XML text, here's the equivalent tabular structure, use this to make your analysis. We can still use our citation to know that these are also identical contents, whether they're in XML tree structure, whether they're in tabular structure. And finally, if we want to do something like integrate our textual information with other information about artifacts, about manuscripts, other sorts of data, then we use a graph structure because, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, RDF, the Resource Description Framework, did I get that right too? I'm not good at these acronyms. It has become more and more important over the last few years as a way to disseminate data over the internet and to aggregate data from multiple sources. So, depending on what we want to do, we simply choose the appropriate format. Use XML tools to edit your text, create your edition, but then do your analysis based on typed tokenization derived from the tabular form of the text. Integrate with non-textual material in an RDF graph. And one of the things that's led to is that now, because we can automatically verify that these different representations are equivalent, we can automatically generate a number of useful artifacts. For example, let me just see if this connection works, yes. The significant detail here is the last modified time, because this is an automated dump of the entire archive of the Homer Multitext project that has all of the XML editions and all of the tabular data automatically collected and generated with a single build task, and assembled from that an RDF file in a TTF format that has a little more than 750,000 RDF statements that captures all of this information in a single graph. So we can take our entire, essentially we can express what we know about everything we have studied in a single graph that we can assemble, and is assembled nightly. That's why these, I'm always thrilled to read the last mod dates and say, yes, it worked again today. It's amazing. But, all right. So that's the background I wanted to use to then return to this initial question. When we can cite everything we're studying, refer to it with a unique URN, and we can ensure that we can integrate anything we're studying into something like a coherent graph, a map, a web, however you want to think of it. How should we write? How should we write? and remembering that we're writing about things we can cite. And so the first thing I have to mostly remind myself of is that writing is not editing. When you spend lots of time with your nose in a very complicated TEI document trying to capture everything you need to as an editor who's concerned with the preservation and legibility and all of these other aspects of the document, you're doing something very different from when we are creating our own prose. We don't have to worry about a lot of things that we do as editors. We can control them. There are no unclear readings. It's my own writing. Right? There, I can produce only what I want to produce. So the short answer is we don't need a lot of structure for our writing. Really minimal structure is all we need. And so, again, just thinking about what's been happening over the last couple of years in the larger world, one example is the very lightweight format called Markdown. How many people here have seen Markdown or are familiar with Markdown? A couple. Okay. Well, in brief, the story behind Markdown is really a wonderful sort of parable for all of this. The inventor of it really just wanted to create web pages. I mean, and honestly, a web page captures the semantics of most of the semantics of what we need in our writing. You've got some paragraphs, you've got some lists, you've got some sections, divisions. We don't need more structure than that. And his response was, why do I need all of those pointy brackets just to generate a web page? You know, I pretty much express all of this in an email and everybody makes sense of it. I just space things out a little bit, I put hyphens in front of list items, everybody knows what I mean. And so he just created this notation called Markdown that, again, the sort of one sentence way to think about it is if you were writing an email, that's pretty much what it would look like. So put stars around something to emphasize them, or 2 stars around something to have really strong emphasis. That's lightweight. And it's also very legible to human readers. And John Gruber, the inventor of it, he didn't go, again, it's a very typical kind of development, right? He didn't start out by writing an abstract grammar. He put together this little tool and wrote a little converter that turned it into his web pages that he wanted. Well, over the last couple of years, it's really caught on with all kinds of people. And there are scores of Markdown editors and converters and filters and tools that will take this lightweight syntax and do all kinds of things with it. Because it's so easy. I mean, there's nothing extra there. Except it doesn't let us cite things. It doesn't let us cite our URLs. So that's essential for our writing. We don't need any more structure, but we do need to be able to cite things. So I'm introducing you today to Citedown. Again, I'm groping for names. I'm not trying to defend any of the names, gladly accept nominations for something better. And all Citedown does is add to Markdown one additional feature, a way to identify a URL. That's it. So in Markdown, the usual syntax is you can put a square bracket around something you want to link and have the link reference the URL next to it in parentheses. We just change the square bracket to a curly bracket, and that means it's a URL. And at that point, we're off and running. So what kinds of tools do we have today in the summer of 2013 for working with this extended Markdown notation? Markdown extended to recognize URNs. Chris Blackwell has developed an HTML site kit, and it works in your browser, and the great thing is there's basically nothing to install. You can just have the header line in your web page that pulls in the right JavaScript, and everything else happens magically. And what it does is it turns those URNs, it resolves them to URLs, so that as far as your browser is concerned, it's just a normal looking web page with URLs in it. And with work on the Homer Multitext, we've been doing that kind of thing. We've been using his site kit for all kinds of things where we don't worry about writing HTML. We don't worry about formatting how we want this stuff to display. We simply say, I'm interested in this artifact, this passage of text, this image. Throw that URL and let the site kit embed it or display it or create the link to it. Ryan Bauman wrote a general Citedown parser, in Java, and this is particularly valuable. It's using a parsing expression grammar, so it's both an implementation in the Java language and a pretty formal specification of the cite-down additions to Markdown. And based on that, then, a couple of recent tools are a Gradle build project. Gradle's a build system for automatically assembling or working with any kind of collection of material, whether it's compiling computer programs or assembling a website. And we've put together a kit for taking cite-down and generating a website. So again, it just uses Chris's site kit to wrap the appropriate stuff around your URNs. They get magically taken care of. And then most recently, a generic use of Ryan's parser to convert cite-down to just generic Markdown. So you can write your cite-down, you write your simple thing that looks like an email, but you put your URNs in it instead of adding URLs. And we can convert it then to totally generic Markdown. That's really nice, because then you have the whole world of Markdown tools available to you. But you haven't had to ever confuse the scholarly reference of a URN with where it's found or how it's resolved to a URL. So it's that, the classic, every problem in computer science can be solved by one more level of indirection. So we've put that level of indirection in there and said, you, the scholar, write with your proper form of citation, and let these filters turn that into something that your generic tools for working with things, expecting URLs, can still work unchanged. You're just interposing between you and those URL-based tools a converter that takes your cite-down, makes pure Markdown out of it. So, examples of some Markdown tools, if you're not familiar with them. There are, in addition to editors, there are all kinds of things that will, do we have any open? No, I don't have any open. Just see if I got it. That's a piece of, that's a Markdown viewer. It will, take a Markdown text and associate a style sheet with it and display it as an HTML page or as a PDF if you want to, generate just quickly, manually, an RTF file, a PDF file, an HTML file. This is an example of the kind of thing that's out there in enormous numbers. There are Ebook Generators. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of LeanPub. It's a marvelous project. I used it recently to put together a draft of an editorial guidebook for the Homer Multitext project that we used this summer as we're doing editorial work. And for LeanPub, you just write Markdown, and it will generate Kindle format MOBIs, PDFs, it'll generate ebooks in just about any kind of format you want. It's an online service, no charge, and if you want to market your book, they'll help you market it, and I think I can't remember their extraordinarily low royalty rate they skim off the top, but because I haven't used that. But I actually wrote this in pure cite-down, and just used a filter to grab those image references, and LeanPub wants them locally, so just save them locally and makes lovely PDFs as well as other forms of ebooks. Slideshow generators. Everybody's got their favorite. So whatever your favorite JavaScript, CSS kit for doing slideshows, very, very good chance somebody's already done the Markdown tool that sets it up for that. So I thought I'd just very, very briefly take a sample document and just illustrate what this looks like and how we can use it. So let me take a pure cite-down document, and I'll just do this in text edit because it'll be a little easier to see if I blow this up 100 times. So this illustrates practically every feature of Markdown that I ever use. The first one is if you want to have a heading, put a hashtag around it. If you want to have like a second tier heading, put 2 hashtags around it. you want to have a third level heading, keep going. Paragraphs are separated by white space, so that's an independent paragraph all by itself. I wanted to emphasize the term Iliad, so I put 2 stars around it. That's the way that stuff works. And if I wanted to look at that in my typical viewer, this is the same document. Okay. So, oh yes, and then if I want to quote something like code, I can put it in backticks. That's my format for code as opposed to regular text. So yeah, that's just about everything I use, except for one other thing. That's the link. So what I added here is the cite-down syntax for defining a URN and citing it. And Markdown has this notation. You can collect all of your bibliography, your sources cited, so to speak, and list them separately. You put an identifier. It doesn't have to be a footnote number. It could be anything you want. In square brackets, colon, and then the URL you want to cite, or the URN you want to cite. This is a URN. It refers to a cite object. It belongs in the Homer Multitext namespace. It comes from a collection of illustrations, images of the Venedicé manuscript, and it's a particular image. So this is a URN that refers to one image in a collection that the Homer Multitext project has put together. And to cite it, all I do is put curly brackets around the phrase I want to link to and attach the reference. So reference number 1 is this. Okay, attach reference number 1 to that curly bracketed phrase. And now if I do this correctly, I might just generate the right thing. So let me clear the screen for a moment. So I've got on my screen that file we were looking at, and I've got one little shell script that's actually going to just do a whole bunch of things to it. And it's going to create about 5 different slideshows and open them up for us. So you've got your choice if you like S5, if you like DZ, all of these various slideshow generators are here, including the fancy stuff with and the links. And so that link was identified with a URN, and this retrieves some information about that image. That image is a citable object. It's been retrieved and represented in this web page from part of the Homer Multitext website, and just as I promised, I wanted to illustrate citing, quoting a portion of the image. This is the this is the opening of the Iliad in the Venedicé manuscript, and it has, at the beginning of pretty much every book, one of the coolest little parlor games you could want, a summary of the entire book of the Iliad in a single dactylic hexameter. Try it. And so if I wanted to refer to that, I could grab just that piece of the image, and I'm going to go back to my document and add a second reference. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. I'm going to create, just that extraneous. Thank you. I'm going to create a second reference. I'm just going to call it 2. I'm going to paste in my URN. And that's it. It looks exactly like the first URN, except that after this @ sign, it has some numbers. Those, I've just stressed, are not pixels. They are scale independent also. They're on a 0 to 1 scale. They're a percentage in effect. So they work at any scale, any version of this image. And now let me edit my text, add a new paragraph, and say that the first book opens with a metrical summary, and I will put brackets around the phrase metrical summary and cite attach reference number 2. And now I'll turn those into a whole slew of web pages and have them fly up there. Okay, let them all finish. Only this time I get just the cited piece. And the citation carries, he said, no matter the scale, I can see it in context as well. And as we scroll, it moves with us. We know where we are. Getting a little carried away, but that I'll find myself a minute here. There we are. Right. So, this raises an interesting question, because one of the general principles that my colleague Chris Brockwell likes to talk about is the distinction between citation and quotation. And by citation, we mean a reference you can follow to find the cited information. Quotation means embedding it, including it in your material. And one of the questions that we have wanted to ask is, do we want to, in addition to this extension to Markdown that lets you identify URNs rather than URLs, do we want to add a second kind of modification, a way to specify not just that you create a link, but that you actually embed that content? We have this in Markdown already. We have this in HTML already a little bit in the special case of images, where you can either set up a link to an image, or you can set up a reference to an image and it'll be embedded in your web page, right? So if you're an HTML world, an A element that links to an image, or an IMG element that pulls in the image. Shouldn't we do the same thing with anything we refer to? An image, an object, a text. And so we've actually done that in Chris's sitekit. We've followed the Markdown convention that when you put an exclamation point in front of the brackets, it means don't link to it, suck in the content. And we get embedded content from texts, from objects, as well as from images. And it's not so easy to know, though, what it means to quote a complex text in a Markdown document. If I'm talking about simple Markdown and I'm citing something that might be a complicated TEI document, what does it mean to quote that? So I'm not sure of the answer to that, and that's not implemented therefore in the cite down to Markdown converter. But more generally, I think that we have challenges not only to rethink specific problems like the difference between citation and quotation, but to think about standards for writing. And one example you may have run into or not, I don't know. If you're a reader of the Chronicle of Higher Education, you might have seen this really horrific case of an American historian who has been teaching for many years the very important case of Sacco and Vanzetti in the United States. That's an important early 20th century trial and particularly relevant today because it concerned two men who were charged with terrorism, in effect, we would say today. And the normal textbook account is that they were, there was a rush to judgment, in sort of contemporary terms. And he was teaching this in one of his undergraduate classes, and a student asked him, well, professor, if there was really no evidence, as our textbook says, why did the trial last 6 weeks? He'd never thought of it in those terms. But he was not an ancient historian, so he was able to go get the transcript of the trial. And he read it. And he discovered that, in fact, however you may think the trial was slanted, it's completely inaccurate to say there was no evidence. They did talk for 6 weeks because there was a lot to talk about. Doesn't mean it was an unbiased trial, but it means that you can't reduce it to say there was no evidence in Sacco and Vanzetti. And so he was an online guy. So I went into Wikipedia and added this note, and it was reverted within seconds. Why? No published sources. But he cited the trial transcript. That's not a peer-reviewed published source. And Wikipedia has a very clear, explicit policy. Their editorial guide is the weight of the published sources, which is a pretty good way to enshrine the echo chamber that is not only the internet, but that is in many cases the print publication world. People cite each other and they don't get back to the primary sources. So this American historian eventually wrote a book on the subject, cited himself, and was relegated to a footnote in the Wikipedia article because he's not the majority of the published sources. He's the only one who's looking at the primary evidence of the trial transcript. But all of the ones that echo each other and just say, but so-and-so said, and so do I, and so-and-so said, and so do I, and created this vast echo chamber, outweigh him by this kind of raw quantitative criterion, which is clearly exactly backwards for historical writing. Right? One primary source ought to trump anything that anyone else claims, right? Without. So one challenge I would like to raise in this group as a subject to think about is I've been starting to think about the idea of a distinctly digital, not Wikipedia, where the criteria is the balance of the published sources, but a wiki site. And I think that it's intriguing to consider whether in a world where we can cite digital material and where people can then use those citations to get access to real primary material, whether we could completely reverse this editorial standard of Wikipedia and instead say, well, let's try writing about, say, ancient history with no secondary sources. What if you had to look at evidence instead of what scholars have said the evidence says? It doesn't mean you don't read the scholarship, but you're not allowed to cite it until you get back behind it and find out what really underlies it. And what if the standard then for contributing wasn't whether or not you have gotten the book through the press, but rather whether you can directly cite appropriate evidence. It's an example, I think, of a kind of question that you couldn't possibly raise in a print environment. You can't, the nature of the print process interposes those kinds of barriers, and I think it illustrates how we've fallen into this sort of instrumentalist thinking that says if print publication gives us a certain kind of review, that's the only kind of review that matters. And we've lost sight of, in this example from at least recent American history, of the more important point, which is that primary material is called primary for a reason. It's not secondary. I mean, we've lost that balance, and isn't it really, we teach in schools in early age, students are supposed to find out from primary sources, but then in our practice we fall into the book dependency, and it's the balance of the published books, often in scholarship as in Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not really such a bad mirror of what goes on in the academic world in many cases. So, a challenge. I don't know if any of you would care to elaborate on that idea or contribute to a future wiki site, but just wanted to throw out a few ideas about how we've been able to at least reflect differently on the process of writing given the automated completion of a complete digital description of our Homer Multitext project in a single build step. So thank you very much. I'd be glad to take questions if you have them.
Thank you, Neel, for, as always, extremely illuminating and challenging presentation. I'm going to refrain from asking the first question because all other questions I had have been knocked out of my head by the fact that this evening's probably going to end with you and I arguing quite vociferously about Wikipedia at some point, but let's not do that here.
Okay.
Someone else have any questions?
Isn't what you're talking about a distinction which is really beginning to be revealed between ancient historians and medievalists on one side and modern historians on another? And one of the modern historian goes and looks at his sources, and what does he look at? Newspaper reports. Now, we're actually looking at newspaper reports when we read Tacitus, but it doesn't feel like, we don't call it that because it's all we've got, right? But they're very used to the pre-digested because they're overwhelmed by volume. And so one of the things that I've been thinking for some time is that the intellectual techniques that we train in ancient history, because we have a manageable amount of stuff, therefore it is inexcusable not to go back to the primary source because you can, that those intellectual strategies are exactly what we need to be teaching people in order to deal with the vast volume of stuff that the web is now throwing at them. And that one of the problems is that young people who are trained entirely in dealing with modern material are exceptionally badly armed for going out into the Great Lake. Well, you go wrong metaphor, but going out into the digital, into the internet, because they haven't been. It's not easy if you teach modern history actually to teach the use of the primary source, just because it's largely because of volume. So that ancient history and teaching people ancient history is more important than it's ever been as a way of equipping people for that kind of gymnastics. But I think that we have to understand that the modern historians are doing something different. The pre-digestion of the food is because they have so much stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
is one of the ways they function.
Sliding scale there, right?
Yes.
And we're usually at one extreme, and they're usually at the other.
Yes. I agree that if you've actually got trial transcript, actually that should trump everything. But
Yeah. Or just to take an example, I've been working on these manuscripts with scholia, and in the world of Homeric scholarship, most people rely on Hartmut Erbs's multi-volume, multi-$1,000 edition of the Scholia Vetera, and it's often described as magisterial and comprehensive. And we started working on editing from the manuscript, and we discovered that about 20% of the text we were editing doesn't appear. And actually, if you read his preface carefully, he doesn't claim that he's being comprehensive. So I mean, he's had some sort of false words put in his mouth, but that's how it's used. And that's how, the Chicago Homer Project is digitized in Erbsa. So great, now we can digitally work with, we don't know what subset of what material. We don't know what the primary evidence is. And so, I think even if we do it on a smaller scale, we're just as susceptible to it in ancient history and classics in a lot of cases.
That's true, but we have less excuse.
I'd say we don't have an excuse, I agree with that.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you're using RDF.
Sure. Well, let's see, we're literally, that's the way that we express everything we have done. So, our editions of our texts are reduced to RDF statements. Our cataloging of information about artifacts and the like are reduced to RDF statements. And what this leads to, is, let's see, well, let's just go to the really kind of ugly nuts and bolts kind of things. You can refer to things by URN and find out what we know about anything, an image, a text, a collection of objects. But you can also find, this is a very, very simple, everything that's immediately connected in the graph to a text, an artifact, an image. And so this, I had a reference to a particular folio. Whoops, I accidentally clicked on it. And what happens is I find out, oh, there are a bunch of texts on that particular folio. There's a bunch of images associated with that folio. And I could now say, well, let me see what's associated with or linked to a particular image. And I'll let that roll out. It'll be a little slow coming from Houston. And we'll just see how things are related, looking at a different view. Here should be slowly arriving from the other side of the Atlantic, I hope.
So you're sort of directly navigating data.
Yeah. And this is just an automated thing that simply says 1 degree of relation. And so we're putting together then customized things depending on our knowledge of the model that do things like, oh, I want to read a passage of the Iliad and related scholia. Oh, and I want to see images of each. That's one way of viewing this kind of stuff. Or other sorts of things. I want to do, well, on the textual side is a simple example. I want to do something like morphological search of the text. There's just a couple of steps in the graph, right? Because I know I've got tokens that occur in passages, and the tokens are associated with lexical identifiers. And so, boom, 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 I'm a couple of steps in the graph, and I've got full morphologically sensitive search of the whole corpus we've got. So those are all, everything is working off just exploring this graph model. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm slow here. I'll have to pass on that, I suppose. But
it's nice just to hear that, just because
yeah.
it's got so many capacities.
So actually, one thing that's is the image is not coming across, but this is just a, to show you pointing brackets in order to say, this is actually a sort of in-house XML translation of an RDF graph. We also offer it in pure RDF, and the RDF is directly exposed through a Sparkle endpoint. So, so all that happens in all of these applications is that you have transformations of the graph for particular views. If I had the image, I'd see what was going on. But so, I don't know how to answer short of saying everything we do with the graph at this point, we do with the RDF graph. And it's been the kind of revolution for us has been being able to build that graph automatically in one step for all the disparate things. Because we're talking about material that's been edited by multiple people over multiple years and integrated into a single system. And this year, one of our major additions has been the automated verification. We don't add new material until it goes through certain kinds of verification. And you talk about a tough mental challenge, trying to teach students a new way of thinking, try to get across the idea that you just specify how you're going to test something before you begin working on it. Yeah. That's a tough one. Oh, we'll fix that later. No, you won't. You never will. If you say that, you will never fix it. Anyway, yes, so what did I just do? We've got things like these, this display is just mapping text onto the image, so you see how they're related to each other. Groups of texts you can look at or not look at, and the individual passages are related as well if they pop up eventually. And all of that's just being done with this civil site kit kind of wrapped around the URN. So the graph is nothing but, everything in the graph is a URN to a URN, and that's all that gets pulled up here. But if we weren't quite so sluggish, the text contents would be embedded as well. Same way that the image contents were embedded. So, probably not a very satisfactory answer to say everything, but it's, it's more or less honest.